Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things imaginary on this Earth and other planets. So, I am Kendra, and I am here with my co-host, Tony. Say hi.
Hello.
And today we are going to talk about...
Kill the beast. Kill the beast. Sorry.
Well, whether we kill him or not, the beast as a symbol and as a character in science fiction and fantasy has been around for a very long time. One might even argue from the very beginning with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So we're going to dive in, and you have a little inspiration or a touchstone for us today, Tony, that you wanted to start with.
Indeed, I do. So this is from A Wrinkle in Time. When Meg is with Calvin and her father on, hell, I forgot to look up what the planet is, but with a certain kind guardian. And the guardian is trying to decide what Meg should call her by pulling thoughts and ideas from Meg's mind. And she goes through a couple of options. She says, "You think of such odd words about me. Thing and monster. I really do not think I am a monster." And then Meg suggests beast. And her guardian says, "Beast, that will do." And she's already decided upon ant, so she calls herself Ant Beast. Which, when we were brainstorming beasts, the first thing I thought of was Beauty and the Beast. But the second thing I thought of was Ant Beast from A Wrinkle in Time. And it's interesting because my first two associations with that word are both positive. The Beast, obviously, over the course of Beauty and the Beast gets this redemption arc. Ant Beast in A Wrinkle in Time is a very positive character who serves as a guardian for Meg.
Sure.
So that, phrasing it as beasts was something that I was like, oh, yes, those are good characters, which is something that I've had in my head for a long time. Phrasing this as monsters, which we also thought about, was very different, had some very different connotations for both of us, I think.
Absolutely. And I don't know, Ant Beast is a great place to start because she provides an entryway for Meg to consider other as something separate from evil. She's already encountered evil, I think, for the first time.
Yes.
Before encountering Ant Beast. And so Ant Beast becomes a way to contrast all things out there, which are different from me, compared to things that are inherently bent, broken, or evil, like it,
yes,
with a capital I,
yes,
which makes an appearance and is monstrous, but is not at all bestial.
No.
In fact, I think it and the evil in A Wrinkle in Time is almost entirely cognitive. Like it's in your head,
The interesting thing about that, the planet Camazotz, which has it and the folks who all act the same, and so on and so forth, is that it itself is a giant brain. Like, everything on Camazotz is so known and yet so terrifyingly monstrous, as you said, whereas Ant Beast looks monstrous, but is very much, much more similar to Meg and Calvin and Charles Wallace and their father than anyone they find on Camazotz, which, of course, I think Madeleine L'Engle was doing on purpose to subvert what the other could be and how the much more other could look exactly like us, or even what's inside us with it, the giant brain. But definitely, I think, teasing apart what is bestial and what is monstrous and what is horrific, those three different things, and where they overlap and where they really don't overlap, is what we want to do today.
I agree. And, so when you say Beast and Beauty and the Beast, I don't even know that that's all that far off the mark for starting this conversation. And of course, my understanding of the original Beauty and the Beast narrative does not go back as far as the story itself. Like, I don't know much about the original French folktale upon which it's based, but I think that there's a reason why there's been a resurgence in these live action adaptations of the Disney classics, and I think that it's the reason why they picked Beauty and the Beast is I mean, there's probably a couple of reasons, but I think that there is a legitimate reason for picking this specific movie now to remake and star Emma Watson and I think it was Dan Stevens or something.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, which I have not yet seen. I missed it in theaters because I was really busy when it was here locally.
I would actually aside, I would actually strongly recommend it. I went into it as kind of like a thing we were doing with Andrew's parents. Like, we were going to the movies, what were we going to see? Beauty and the Beast, everyone will like that. And I was like, ugh, whatever. But it was actually delightful. It updated the story in a lot of important ways. Like, I don't know, I was just so prepared to be underwhelmed, and instead that movie really surprised me and delighted me. So not to veer too far off, but the new live action Beauty and the Beast actually quite good.
No, I mean, I think that's okay. So the 3 live actions they've done so far, correct me if I have missed one, but it's The Jungle Book, Cinderella, and Beauty and the Beast. And
I think that's right.
At least when it comes to The Jungle Book, like there's definitely like similarities in terms of like the things that they've chosen to highlight. The bestial or the beast is something different from the bestial, and the bestial is something different from the monstrous, and the monstrous is something different from the monster, as different from the animal. So The Jungle Book also explores some of the same themes, and I agree with you, at least in terms of my experience with The Jungle Book, that in general Disney is making good decisions in terms of what it chooses to keep about the original narratives and what it chooses to dispense with. There were still, as we mentioned in our podcast where we discussed The Jungle Book, there were some like whitewashing issues still in terms of the casting, but in general, like they still made leaps and bounds improvements over the original, and they got rid of the weird like sexist ending. So that was A+.
Yeah.
And so I look forward to seeing Beauty and the Beast. We have purchased it for the library, but of course it went out immediately and has not come back.
Of course. Yeah. Well, speaking of The Jungle Book, we actually have a similar podcast to this in which we talked specifically about the live-action adaptation of The Jungle Book and the Harry Potter spin-off Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and we covered some general thoughts about animals in science fiction and fantasy back then, but we talked mostly about those 2 movies. So you can kind of consider this a sequel podcast to that one, where we dig more into, again, the monstrous, the bestial, and the horrific, and talk about what those are. So yeah, let's do some things.
Talk about, let's do a thing. I would like to talk about, maybe start our podcast, well, we've already started. I would like to segue into talking about perhaps the most popular, currently living purveyor of the monstrous and the horrific, and that is, do you pronounce it Guillermo or Guillermo?
I think it's Guillermo.
Guillermo del Toro, and can I tell a story?
Absolutely.
So when I was in, I think it must have been 11th grade. This is in Sydney, Australia, in our little townhouse. I have very, very vivid memories of my first encounter with Guillermo del Toro, which, of course, I did not recognize at the time as the beginning of a long and fruitful relationship. But I had an assignment due that I had been procrastinating on and pushing back, and finally it was the night before this essay was due, and it was a film criticism essay. So I needed to go and pick a film, watch it, and break down visually what it was doing. So I went to whatever the Australian version of Blockbuster was at the time, and I ran my hands along the stacks of movies, and this was, I think it might still, no, it was probably DVDs already. I ran my hands along a couple of cases, and I pulled out one that had a really great cover, and was like, okay, I have to watch this. I have like 2 hours to watch and get this essay done, so I'm just going to grab one off the shelf and run. And I did not read the jacket description. And I started watching it, and so the film in question is Guillermo's Mimic, which is about giant cockroaches taking over New York City and eating people. And and like this is early Guillermo. and like it's less fantastical than a lot of Guillermo has become. Like, it's not Pan's Labyrinth at all in terms of like the visuals and the fantastic elements. And we'll get to talk about Pan's Labyrinth later. But yes. I was watching this movie, and like I just imagine me, who'd never seen a horror movie in her life, whose entire film experience at that point was constituted of The Lord of the Rings, this movie about sled dogs racing a Iditarod, and this Little Women, and The Great Train Adventures of Australia. That was like pretty much all I'd ever seen. And then I watched Mimic for class. And my parents have no idea why or what I'm doing. And I watched this movie, and I'm horrified. Like, I am literally so sickened by the cockroaches, but I couldn't stop watching, not because I liked the movie, but because it was an assignment and I had to finish it. And I finished the movie, sat there for a couple of minutes and like breathed deeply, and then I went and wrote the essay in a half hour and got an A on it, and that's the story of how I got A on an assignment for a movie that repulsed me so much. But at the same time, there was something interesting about it. And now as an adult, I think I should go back and rewatch it and kind of conquer that demon, because it is to this day like the most stark memory in my mind of being horrified and repelled by something on the screen.
So and these giant cockroaches that like kill people in New York, are those substantially different from bugs you had naturally in Australia?
I mean, there is a slight scale difference, but not as much as there is between American cockroaches. And, but I mean, actually, I think Texas cockroaches might give Australians a run for their money. The thing with Australian cockroaches is that there's a specific breed we had around which could fly. I think it was called the Aboriginal cockroach. So they were these giant, like 2 to 3 inch long cockroaches that could fly and get everywher.
Awesome.
So you couldn't like leave your windows open or anything. and I mean, they make great parrot food. So like, yay parrots. Good for you.
And then this turned into a podcast that is just, what the fuck, Australia?
Which is pretty much how I live every day of my life. But
Yes.
how did I survive that for 7.5 years? But at the same time, I still kind of want to go back. I haven't even told you about the funnel web stories that I have. So
oh my god, I don't know. I don't want to hear those. We're going to do a podcast specifically about spiders in science fiction, so we can save that.
Yeah, and I promise we won't spend too much time talking about Shelob or that like half-hour scene in The Hobbit Part 2, because yeah. We'll mention them, but let's get back to the beast.
Yes,
my point in bringing up Mimic was there is something kind of wonderful about your first real encounter with the bestial or the beast or the monstrous and the horrific. And for me, they were all tied up together. Like I got that as a lump sum payment watching Mimic. And I only began to disentangle things later. You know, my parents being who they were, we were on a Disney, what do you call it, boycott? We were Disney boycotting for most of my childhood.
Yeah.
So I didn't get to really watch Disney the way that other people did. I didn't have Beauty and the Beast as the first thing in my mind when I considered bestial for a long, long time. Now I watch Disney because I work with kids, but I didn't when I was a kid. Fun fact, I get to watch Moana for the first time because of my work next weekend, so we'll have some thoughts on that. Moana! I know the whole soundtrack. But like, okay, so Guillermo was a great place to enter this canon, though, and to talk about this I guess, confusion of concepts, because Mimic was like everything all rolled into one, and he has since teased out a lot of these concepts in his other movies. So he's got like Pan's Labyrinth and The Shape of Water coming out later this year, and then there's Pacific Rim, which isn't strictly like a beast film in a sense. It's like an action adventure. It's not as horrific as some of his other films. But like, what's your experience with Guillermo? Do you have anything like, especially in respect to like Pan's Labyrinth?
Well, that was the first movie by him that I ever saw, and I saw it when it came out in theaters. I think maybe twice. I definitely remember. I think maybe it was just once, because that movie is one of those movies where I was like, I saw that once. Maybe I'll watch that again in 10 years, but that was fucked up. It's amazing. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, it was so, I don't just want to say so good. It worked on so many different levels, and it was so both satisfying and dissatisfying, both as kind of like a more magical realism where, you know, like young traumatized girl finds refuge in fantasy land that isn't there, versus like fantasy land exists and young traumatized girl stumbles into it, and death and war and all of these important things. Like, it's hard even now, and I have seen it since then. That was like whenever it first came out. I've definitely seen it within the past 5 years, but it's so difficult to get a handle on. I think it is a really good representation of beast, monster, and horror, all sort of like packed into one really beautiful and terrifying package, and then sort of extracted in really different ways and pulled out like very, I'm imagining strings of like monstrous taffy here as you're looking at, like, the ways that people can be monstrous to each other. Because like when I think of Pan's Labyrinth, I think of the faun as one great example of what Pan's Labyrinth does, but I also think of the horrific general guy. I can't remember his name right now.
Yeah,
But
and
like,
I think of the scenes where she's running, because there's some really great, like, not as fantastical scenes in terms of, like, the characters appearing in them, where it's still horrific.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of, like, him, the general guy bashing in the face of the young farmer and, like, shooting the young protagonist, and I am just like, what happens there is so much more horrific than any of the fantastical horror, and yet, like, those things are both more effective because of what they're projected against, and it's just a phenomenal movie.
They coexist on screen.
Yes.
Yeah. For those who haven't seen Pan's Labyrinth, what would be like a 10-second recap of plot?
It's been a while. It's set in Spain during the First World War, leading up to the First World War, between the first and the second. It basically, young girl with her mother. Her mother is pregnant, has been widowed, is being really strenuously courted by this terrible Spanish fascist general guy who is just awful. And the young girl discovers different elements of fantasy and an attempt to potentially escape her world, and she gets more and more drawn into it. And yeah, that's a terrible summary, but that's basically what I remember.
Yeah, I think, it's useful to kind of find a common ground in terms of, like, basic plot. So yeah, I think that works. And then, he's done other films since then. Have you seen a lot of Guillermo's other films?
As far as I know, I'd have to look at a list on Wikipedia or something to know everything that he's done. I know I've seen Pacific Rim, and I find it actually interesting in our little cheat sheet document that you wrote Pacific Rim was playing on a lot of classic body horror.
Oh, yeah.
Will you talk some more about that? Because I find that really interesting and a good segue into some of the other monstrous and horrific things we want to talk about.
Sure. So the first thing that pops to mind when I think of Pacific Rim, which I enjoyed, but not to the same extent as some other films that I love. It's like a decent, solid action flick. I've watched it while drunk. I've watched it while sober. It's all right. It does a good job of being like a kaiju Godzilla kind of film.
Yes.
But what leaps to mind in terms of, like, remembering specific scenes is the one where those scientists cut the kaiju open and then the other kaiju jumps out, which is classic body horror move right there. And so, like, that is what leaps to mind when I remember Pacific Rim. And I don't know that Guillermo would be bothered by that. I think, like, that's, like, fine by him if you remember the body horror bits, because they recur in multiples of his films. And I think that there's a fair amount of gore and body horror going on in Pan's Labyrinth. There's definitely loads of body horror in Mimic, but Pacific Rim is one of the few examples where you take a mainstream action adventure flick and inject body horror without it becoming a horror film, right? So I think it is different from standard kaiju films in that way, in that most kaiju films are about large-scale carnage, like stomping office blocks and things like that, but Pacific Rim is about, like, the intimacy of the violence, and you see up close and personal several people's different encounters with kaiju, and their deaths, whether by kaiju or otherwise, So I think that if we look at Pacific Rim not just as, great action adventure flick, but also as body horror, then it can take on layers that I find more appreciable than just standard action adventure flick.
Right, because
that's kind of where I come from.
If we go back to, like, thinking about monsters, you can think of Pacific Rim. I mean, that's kind of an obvious go-to. Movies from the past 5 to 10 years that are really dealing heavily in monsters, and we can think too of, like, the Godzilla movie that came out, the King Kongs that have come out. But in terms of new properties that are really trafficking heavily in monsters, I think Pacific Rim would be, at the top of the list. Right, but also, thinking about it not only as a monster movie, but thinking about it as a really horrific movie that does actually play with some of those body horror tropes is a really different way to think about it. And I think that definitely leads into some other thoughts about overlaps between monsters and monstrous things and horror, especially body horror.
Yeah, do you want to lead us there? Like, what would be the next step?
Absolutely.
So we talked Guillermo. What next?
Obviously, we need to address Alien, the Alien franchise. I don't want to spend...
Alien in the room?
Very much so. And I don't want to spend too much time on it because, again, that's something we talked about specifically a long-ass time ago. That's one of our first podcasts. The audio is terrible. I'm not sure, actually, whether this is a plug for folks to go back and listen to it.
It's not.
Or
Don't
not.
go
It's
listen
kind
to
of
that
not.
one.
But with that said, I imagine that we'll revisit Alien in some depth in the future. So it's just to acknowledge that if we're talking about monsters, if we're talking about body horror, obviously the Alien franchise is on top of, not just on top of, but inside of all of that.
And it's iconic.
Yes.
It's iconic, kind of monstrous. And it really will help us, I think. I'm going to let you dive into this because you're still the alien geek among the two of us. But it does help tease apart some of the differences, again, between the monstrous and the alien and the beast. So do you want to dive into that a little bit? Because you've got a lot more background.
For sure. And I actually want to, in maybe kind of a weird way, talk about the xenomorphs from Alien and the Borg from Star Trek in the same way. Because in both cases, they're playing on a lot of the same fears. There's this conversion, especially later in Star Trek when the Borg would show up again, how you went from yourself to something else because of an encounter with the Borg. Same thing with the alien, because if you got face hugged, you went from person to essentially egg incubator, and then you would have the chest burster come out, quite unfortunately, and obviously then you die. With the Borg, it's not as clear, but you do kind of, again, become the monster in the same way that Alien leads to that. Even though you, the you that has been face-hugged, is dying, the monster is coming out of you. You are becoming that thing that is monstrous. Which, I know for sure that is playing on really, really ancient ideas. There's nothing new about that, but Alien really streamlined it in a way that lined up well with science fiction and what science fiction wasn't really doing at the time, but really wanted to, pull out. And of course, there are comparisons to be made to, like, the bug-eyed monsters of Golden Age science fiction. BEMs. I like saying BEM. So, BEM. But what I really love about the Borg is that it takes this idea that you have going in Alien that is really about body horror, really about, not just becoming the monster, but giving up your life for the monster involuntarily, and puts this ideological twist on it. So instead of just dying once you have been Borgified, you lose your individuality. Maybe you can see what's going on the same way that happens in Animorphs when a Yeerk enters your brain, but you can no longer act, you can no longer speak, you can no longer do anything basically that you want to do because you've been subsumed by the hive mind for the Borg. You've been taken over by the Yeerk in Animorphs. And what I was thinking about is that it seems to me such a Western take on body horror that, like, you're taking the body and in a way that was, kind of like classically defiling it in Alien and in lots of other examples where it's dead or it's mutilated or something, you're turning that into a loss of agency. Yeah, exactly. And that is a new kind of idea of what makes a monster. It's you, it's us, except you're not you anymore. And that's definitely been played with in the decades since the Borg were introduced to Star Trek.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's basically the entire plot of Stargate.
Yeah.
all however many hundreds upon thousands of seasons that they've done between all of their different Stargate universes. So the notion of losing agency, is that somehow more horrific? Is that somehow more monstrous than actually showing us a monster?
Right. And that's really what I come back to because, thinking about Alien and thinking about the Borg from Star Trek in the same breath, like, what is ultimately the more horrific idea there? Is it that, you've been essentially raped and impregnated and forced to give birth to this thing that kills you, which is horrific on so many different levels? Or is it ultimately more horrific than essentially all of that still happening, except remaining alive and not being able to do anything about it? And I don't really want to set these up as, like, which one is worse? Are they, like, can we say this is better? Because they're both, like, really, really horrific, and I guess we're just sort of riffing on that idea with Star Trek and sort of, like, punching it and trying to make it into a newer thing, even though it wasn't really, but...
Well, and feminist theory would argue that it's essentially men internalizing or projecting their fears of what it what they do to women only enacted against them. Like, people have made arguments about Alien being kind of a reverse rape scenario for, I don't know, since the movie came out. And the notion of loss of agency, the notion of loss of voice, the notion of carrying something that you don't want that has been forced upon you. I mean, that, symbolically speaking, that does line up. But I don't think that it's all that's going on there. Despite there being like a whole, actually several like Wikipedia pages dedicated to the enfant and the child terrible, sort of as tropes in cinema and literature. And we could talk about extant, our favorite hate-hate relationship in terms of shows. So I would just like throw that as a caveat. Like, feminist theory would and will and does have a field day with this kind of symbolic action on the screen, because it does. Like, it's our experience right there. You know, that's a woman's body. Only you're projecting it onto a male body too, and somehow that makes it more horrific. Why? You know, insert ...
Yeah. For sure. So we have a really interesting and awful overlap of the monstrous and the horrible there. I wonder if maybe we want to pull back a little bit or go forward. I don't know. Movement metaphor. Monstrous and monsters and beasts. Like, let's talk a little bit more. Maybe get away from some of the horror, because I have a story. Well, it's not really a story, but I'm thinking about your experience with Mimic and how that was one of the first movies that you saw. I think I've mentioned before that the first movie I saw in theaters was Jurassic Park. And I want to talk about that a little bit, and not really in the same way, because I don't really have a story to tell there, other than I was 6, and that was probably too young to be seeing Jurassic Park in the theater. In part because, like, 6-year-olds do not sit still for the length of Jurassic Park, and I can attest to that. But
my sister had to walk out in the middle of it, and she was older than you. So, not everyone responded to Jurassic Park, especially the toilet scene where the guy gets chomped. Not everyone responds to that the same way.
Right.
With wonder and awe and amazement at the animatronics.
Right. And I think that
really good.
Yeah, right. I mean, like, when I think of Jurassic Park, and when I watch it, as I do from time to time because I love it, you know, the fact that the animatronic effects hold up as well as they do, and I'm thinking specifically of the iconic T-Rex attack scene when it flips the Jeep and the kids are in the Jeep, and, you know, Grant gets out with the flare, and then we go into the toilet scene, and etc. Like, that just, it all works so well. It's just like, that is such a masterful scene.
Well, and I would argue that, and this is not in our show notes, but I would argue that Jurassic Park was one of the films that flipped our like first association of the monstrous away from the bug-eyed monster. I mean, there are still bug-eyed monsters, and there's also the slimy slug-like monster of Alien, or whatever you want to call it. They're still bug-like in a sense.
Right.
And it flipped it to something that we'd never considered monstrous before, because we'd never seen it like on screen as something that could eat us alive before.
Right.
You know?
Right. And what I like so much about Jurassic Park, well, there are a couple different directions I want to go with this. So the first is, one of the reasons I think it works so well is it took something, dinosaurs, that a lot of people really liked, I really liked, and then showed them in a way that made you question, well, would I really like that? In a way that, say, you know, when you go to a zoo or something, which is exactly, you know, some of the parallels that the movie and the book were trying to draw, and you see a lion or a tiger, you go to an aquarium and you see some sort of like aquatic predator, you can kind of see sort of like, maybe that's not what I want to be hanging around with. But then a lot of the time they look lethargic. And so what Jurassic Park did was it took this idea, especially the idea of dinosaurs as like large and slow and dumb, and updated it. And kind of turn them into monsters, and kind of turn them into beasts. And the reason I'm sort of saying kind of, is that one of the goals of both book and movie, and I think maybe less subtly maybe with not very much subtlety in either, but both were really trying to be on the cutting edge of paleontological science, and say, you know, this idea that a lot of people have of, like, slow illustrations in books where dinosaurs are, like, fat and brown and dragging their tails on the ground and maybe living in swamps, like, is not at all accurate. And instead what you have is this scientifically approved, check, you know, really potentially scary situation where these creatures are indeed monstrous, but then characters and the narration itself is also sort of saying, yes, but they're just animals, they're beasts. There is no positive or negative valence to them whatsoever, whereas the monsters have this really negative connotation. Something monstrous is something not very good, whereas something bestial is, maybe more foundationally natural, which is to say, something that you would find that, maybe can eat you, but maybe will be your friend, we don't know. But and if I can say one more thing about Jurassic Park, it's
you
that...
say many more things about Jurassic Park.
Thank you. It's that in all of those ways that Jurassic Park succeeded back in the late 80s and early 90s when the book was being written and then released, when the movie was being put together and then released, those are all of the same reasons why Jurassic World failed. It took, those basic themes and basically created, without understanding what was working there, created a movie monster. Bog standard, didn't look any different from what we'd already seen, really crapped it up with a lot of bad CGI and slapped the Jurassic Park name on it. And again, we could go, and we have gone into the many reasons that Jurassic World didn't work, but I think in terms of this podcast and what we're talking about today, it's losing that balance between seeing dinosaurs as animals or beasts and seeing them as scary, rapacious, gonna run at you and eat you up kind of monsters.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Now, I did not have the same childhood of Jurassic Parkness that you did, so I wasn't as disillusioned with I was betrayed like a history that I loved, because I still haven't seen all the Jurassic Park movies in full. I should, because I enjoy them. I always do, but I just wasn't there as a kid. If my parents were going to be willing to boycott Disney, you can imagine what they were willing to do with Jurassic World. I think when I saw Jurassic World in theaters, because I did see Jurassic World in theaters with a group of kids who were really into the original Jurassic Park, and they were, they were like 6 and 9, I want to say, or something like that, and they just didn't get it. Like, they watched the movie and they're like, but what's happening here apart from dinosaurs chomping?
Yeah.
There was no plot really holding the thing together, and so if they can't hold the plot together, they definitely aren't going to hold a sophisticated conversation about what it means to be animal and bestial and all these different things. So, but for you, the sophisticated conversation that wasn't happening in Jurassic World and is happening in Jurassic Park, what does it say about human nature that we crave more of these narratives and that we are able to create a multimedia franchise around this narrative out of the ether, out of the blue, kind of, just as soon as those films came out, we were suddenly obsessed with dinosaurs as monsters, as all kinds of things.
Right. Well, I think peak unsubtlety in Jurassic Park, the book, and slightly in the movie, there's just not as much of it in the movie, is this debate about human nature, especially human as creator. Because essentially what you're doing here is humans that are essentially innocent, the scientists like Grant and Sattler, and the kids who come to the park and view it and, have this very academic / appreciative attitude towards dinosaurs versus the humans like John Hammond and the lawyer who is associated with the business enterprise, who are the creators of these dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs are therefore their avatars in the world. So really it is a clash of human versus human, with dinosaurs stuck in the middle. Which, again, is something that is there pretty clearly in Jurassic Park, but, something that Michael Crichton was trying to essentially be a whistleblower about, don't play with genetic power, because terrible things can happen and then dinosaurs will eat you. Although that was, very
and
specific.
And women will inherit the earth.
Right, women will inherit the earth. But for sure, I think a lot of what works here goes back to basic formulas from things like Frankenstein and Jekyll and Hyde and Beowulf, as as far as we're thinking about monsters that exist, monsters that we create, how are those monsters interacting with human nature? Essentially, most monstrous things, most beasts, most horrific works in science fiction and fantasy, I think, are playing with those basic ideas.
Sure. What it means to be a creator, what it means to be created. So in a sense, it's kind of a return to our obsession over the Eden narrative. What does it mean to be cast out or unhappy with your creation or at odds with your creation?
Yes.
And how do we survive that, in a sense? Not just physically, but metaphysically and spiritually. How do you survive that kind of a break from your normal, unvaried, unthinking existence? Which I think that's what's so special about the Jurassic Park narrative in my limited exposure, is that you have people who come to this world who aren't a part of the world, and they're seeing it with fresh eyes.
Yes.
And it is a break from their normal, going to school, whatever kind of routine those kids were supposed to be having.
Yeah, right. And I think it's important to not just subsume the monstrous and the bestial into the larger category that is alien or other, because we did have a podcast about the alien. And I know we mentioned several of the things that we've mentioned during this podcast, but, then it felt more like we were trying to get our heads wrapped around what it could mean to write about the alien, or the way that folks wrote about alien, when really what is alien is not something you can write about or experience or anything, because it is by definition alien. But when we're thinking about monsters in this way, and we're thinking about beasts in this way, really, it seems like what it comes down to is we are just interacting with more humans, whether those humans are, creating monsters in the way that Mary Shelley's character did in Frankenstein, or whether humans are creating monsters in the way that geneticists did in Jurassic Park. Essentially, what you're interacting with is more humans.
Yeah, and it's a Jekyll and Hyde narrative too, isn't it? We split ourselves into the monstrous and the quote-unquote normal.
Yeah.
But then what's normal is also broken and monstrous in and of itself. So when you're reading the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde narrative, it's fascinating to consider that both of them are monstrous. One is physically monstrous. One is, I don't know whether you'd call it spiritually monstrous, but he violates a lot of quote-unquote laws of decent behavior and human nature, and treating others with dignity and respect. So I think it's really interesting, though, that we moved from Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein early on to the bug-eyed monster, what happened there, and then from the bug-eyed monster to dinosaurs and Alien and Predator. And we haven't talked about Predator because I don't know as much about it.
I don't either.
Obviously, I've seen scenes from it here and there, because Alyssa, our occasional visitor on this podcast, she loves the Alien versus Predator mashup films. But you had this time, and I guess you could say it was 80s through 90s, where we were reconsidering what it meant to be alien again, and it went from the bug-eyed monster to all of these different kind of manifestations of what could be monstrous, what could be bestial, what could be evil.
Yeah, right.
And they're always mashed up a little bit together. It's messy to disentangle them, but it's so cool. It's so cool that every now and then there's a generational shift in what we think of.
There is, and
visually.
I think, that's exactly what I was just going to say, that it's helped along by technology, both behind the narrative and in front of the narrative. If we're thinking about movies and TV shows and video games, the kind of monsters you can illustrate on screen are obviously much more complicated and complex than could be illustrated on screens, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. And then we get back to, the age of no screens whatsoever. And even behind the narratives, something like Jurassic Park, which is, a cautionary tale of genetic science, is something that, in terms of the hard science elements, is obviously not something you would have seen. You would have, even going back again to Frankenstein, I think that you have this story of the monster and creating the monster tangled up in what we would consider science fiction from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't a neat transition, but these early monsters were pretty, serious business, right? It was our humanity is at stake.
Yes.
When we consider the monsters. But what really pleases me about a lot of modern interpretations or revisitations to the monstrous is that we're using humor to subvert what is monstrous, or what we consider monstrous, and reframe our relationship with what's monstrous. So what leaps to mind, we're going to talk about this again in future podcasts, but Spaceman of Bohemia features something again that confuses the alien and the monstrous and the bestial and all of these different things, but it's got a giant pair of emoji lips on it. That is the image. You have Children of Time, which takes a swarm of spiders, which normally would definitely get my hackles up. But then by, I guess, like satirizing what we think of as spider and what we think of as human, it takes you to this place where you're rooting for the spiders, and that in and of itself, that is humorous to me. It's not quite as like in your face, literally humorous as Spaceman of Bohemia's alien spider thing. But then you have like Ghostbusters, old and new. We don't need to get into that right now, but like old and new. And then we have like things like Teen Wolf, where you have a lacrosse playing high school werewolf who collects all of his friends together. Some of them are special and some are werewolves and some are not. And one is like this fox spirit thing from Japan. It's crazy in there. But it takes this notion of what's bestial, and it's like, well, it's basically just a teenage boy with hormones. And it's hilarious. It's really well written. It's actually one of my favorite like teen-oriented shows that's still on air. Then you have things like Independence Day, which was very like slapstick comedy. It took all of our stereotypical alien tropes and like slapped them around a little bit, sometimes physically, like actually on screen. And Will Smith, of course, has a great like comedic tone to everything that he does. Yeah. And I don't know.
Right.
There's also
and I think like thinking about that list that you just offered and other things that might be added to it, and I actually am having a hard time coming up with anything right off the top of my head. But what's interesting about that is essentially what, you said humor, and I think that humor plays a large part in the works that I know that you mentioned. But essentially what those did is, and what other works have done, is they've taken the stories of monsters, stories of beasts, stories of horror, and said, well, your emotions aren't limited to this. Like, you can laugh at this. You can find joy in these things. You can be not just scared of it, but you can be maybe disgusted by it at the same time. And maybe those seem like kind of the same thing, but, when you have, when you're playing with a lot of different emotions, that could be really, really different also. So I think that, the list that you just gave us is actually really important as a way to show that monsters don't just have to be horrific, that we can have overlap there, and we continue to have productive overlap there, but we can have a lot of other emotions attached to films, books, TV shows that have monsters.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to, I mean, I know we're close to having to close out the show. I mean, what do you think is the future of the monstrous, or the monster, and the beast in books? I mean, we haven't talked as much about books as we have about film, and I think that we can unpick that a little bit. But what do you think is the future of the monster, the monstrous?
Well,
the beast,
if I can pull on a couple of recent books that you just mentioned, Children of Time and Spaceman of Bohemia, what works about those for me is, again, that they're playing with monsters and the monstrous, but they're not held up as something that's just horrific, something to be terrified of. They're, really introducing more emotions, showing you as a reader, telling you as a reader that you can feel more things about these monsters. But they're also doing it in a way that I feel like, say, Ghostbusters and Independence Day, and I'm not trying to set up a movie versus book comparison here, they just happen to be all movies on one side, all books on the other. But I think what those did is they kind of put in this effort to really try and make those things seem funny, to satirize what had been horrific and monstrous before. And so there wasn't really that sincerity, that idea that you could, feel really complicated emotions with respect to monsters, because monsters were obviously this terrible, awful thing, or you had to laugh at them, turn that completely on its head. But really, we can now do really complicated things, narratively, emotionally, atmospherically, what's the word that I'm thinking of? The Kate Bernheimer thing. Effectively, you can do all of that in a way, and also have it be a monster story, but not necessarily channel the monster story, as if there's only one, or one way to feel about it, or one way
a
to
multiplicity of monsters.
Yes. So that's kind of the future that I see. That, like, monsters, we can channel it and say, monsters, yes, this is a good thing, and we don't have to draw barriers between what is the monster and what is the beast, in the way that I kind of have done throughout this podcast. But that's kind of the future that I see for monsters and the monstrous in science fiction and fantasy.
Well, that, I think, is a perfect place to leave the show today.
Cool.
Any closing thoughts?
I am a monster.
You're a monster. All right, there you have it.
Yeah.
Tony, where can you find us?
You can find us on iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts on your mobile phones. I just said mobile phones. Is that a really British thing to say?
You are ancient. You are so old.
Very. Well, podcast app on iOS or iTunes or SoundCloud. If you search for the Imaginaries, you will find us. You can also find all of our back episodes on YouTube. We are also on a spiffy new Squarespace website at www.imaginaries.net, and you can always follow us and see what we're releasing and what's going on with both of us on Twitter. The podcast is imaginary_pod. I am at deviance_engine, and Kendra is intrepid_ly.
Intrepidly.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that's that. There's our show. Thank you for listening. Please look us up online. Give us a comment, a holler. We obviously consider suggestions. We are going to pull a friend of ours on the show to discuss Basement of Bohemia in the near future.
Yes.
So if you have suggestions, we'd love to hear them because we like to diversify what we read with the recommendations of others. So thank you so much for listening. Go watch the Great British Baking Show, and we'll see you back here in a week or so.
Goodbye.
Bye.